Alright, this is all one take, so forgive me if it's weird or a little rambling. Now, I'm going to just say this right now. I'm going to make a bunch of videos kind of giving some good advice and like just things to think about when you're trying to write stuff, specifically like novels or fan fiction. Honestly, I'm including fan fiction in this because that's a good way to get practice for your writing. You got to start somewhere. If you can write anything, start writing it. Don't try, I'm going to say this right now. You can imitate other people or whatever. Do not try to make your own version of something that's pre-existing, basically beat for beat. Play around with it. That is my biggest bit of advice. No matter what you do, if you're working on writing, if you're trying to get better at writing, do not stop writing. Keep writing regardless, and play around with it. Don't stick to just your comfort zone. Try sticking your feelers out and figuring out something that and try new things. You might find something that you're really good at that you didn't realize it would be that good. You were that good at, or something you enjoy writing. And if you enjoy writing it and you keep at it, you're gonna get way better at it because you're gonna be a lot more engaged with it. Now, specifically for this video, I'm gonna be discussing some stuff that does technically count as a narrative device, and I will explain that in what that means in a second. But it can all basically be boiled down to the consequences of what you're writing. So, a narrative device specifically, and I'm gonna kind of just boil this down to easy terms because I am a English major in college in my senior year, and specifically creative writing. So I do kind of know some more like specific college level crap. I'm gonna boil it down to make it easy. A narrative device is stuff like the domino effect, the butterfly effect. There's one called Chekhov's gun, which the easy way to explain it that a lot of people use, like the kind of saying that goes with it, is if you mention there's a gun on the table, there's got to be some reason why you mentioned the gun on the table. You got to bring it up. It's got to be important later on down the line. And the reason for that, and I'm going to specifically focus on this Chekhov's gun for a second so I can kind of give you an idea of what I mean by consequences, is think about it. If you have a setting where there is no reason for someone to specifically make note of the fact that there's guns lying around or whatever, there's got to be a reason why you bring it up. If you have a character that is not used to something and they come into a room and notice there's a gun on a table because they've not seen guns around before, that's something you can go with. If you just mention it and the character doesn't seem to make a big deal of it, why did they still take note of it? Why did you think that was important to point out? If you just mention there's something on the table, but it's not really got a big importance other than maybe overly describing a room, or just the character thinks it's a little interesting about it, what's the point? Why did you point out that very specific object? Now, this isn't exactly for everything. If you say, oh, there's a bunch of clutter around, there's a bunch of cans lying around and there's a gun on the table, it can say stuff about the owner of the room. But if there's no other real framing for that mention, it's going to have to be something that has consequences down the line. Not necessarily has to, but like it would be better if it does have consequences. It's like a better way to explain this is if the camera in a movie focuses in on something on the table and for a little too long in clear focus and makes it clear that like you need to look at that, but it's not shown again or it's not used in any way, it's gonna be like, what was the point? That's kind of what I mean by what I'm trying to explain. if you're like watching an action movie and they focus in on like a sword leaning against the wall for a second, but they for a little, second longer than, oh, it's just a passing glance, but it's not used again, you're gonna be or mentioned at all in the movie, you're gonna be like, why did you do that other than to be like, hey, look at this cool sword? It's gonna feel like a lot of nothing. That's kind of the point of this little narrative device check thing. And it kind of just shows how you can kind of get a little creative with things in a way. Because a lot of what makes a setting or a story really interesting is, well, the way you think about the consequences of stuff. So, say you've got, I'm gonna be honest, I read a lot of horror, especially body horror, like Cronenberg type stuff in a way. And I write and like some psychological horror type stuff. And then I also write a lot of modern and historical fantasy. But I don't do like Tolkien type stuff, and I don't do D&D type stuff. I do a lot more towards, on the fantasy scale, the hard fantasy side of things. And this is where there is very hard limits and rules for things. That's why it's called hard fantasy. It's stuff like, when I'm writing things, if I'm writing, say, granted, this is mostly for my original stuff where I don't have to worry about like the limitations of, say, Harry Potter setting. Because you got to keep in mind, I'm one of the people who is writing Dark Knight Deku over on AO3. My AO3 account is the same as my YouTube. So I'm writing Dark Knight Deku on AO3. I have a ton of stuff on there, honestly. And I'm also the person who writes what I call the Benadryl fic, which is the Harry Potter One Piece crossover magical monster trio, Hari of Centaurium. I'm going to be honest, there's one I jokingly call it the Benadryl fic because I write it when I have a fever. I had to take Benadryl because I'm having allergy issues. I have not slept in a lot because of an insomnia attack. Basically, when my brain is a little wonky because yeah. So, I digress. When I'm writing stuff, I think about what would happen if you did XYZ. I think of how would this affect the world. So, say you're writing something where one of the main characters is like a druid or something, for example. Well, what would the consequences be of like the standard druid powers, which I mostly focus on the plant stuff, because animal stuff is usually like talking to animals, and I can do body horror with the transformation stuff. That I've got down. But in regards to the plant things, that's a little, people don't really think about the consequences of that. Plants take nutrients to grow, plants take water to grow, and plants will spread roots out as they grow. And in some cases with trees, they can break concrete when they get big enough with their roots. So if a druid forces a plant to grow too fast, it's going to cause problems with, breaking the ground, which would cause problems. If you have heard if you've seen videos of like rhubarb being forced to grow really fast, it sounds like popcorn. So there's going to be a lot of racket. And that's just rhubarb. If you're looking at a tree, that's going to sound really loud and probably hurt your ears a lot. It's going to sap the ground of nutrients because the plant is trying to supply itself with stuff to help it to make it grow, because if it doesn't, it's just going to not do well. And it's going to take a lot of water, so it's going to absolutely just suck the place desert dry real fast if you're not in a very specific area. It's going to cause issues with, there's just so many things that can go wrong if you do that. And if you do it too often, you can turn it a forest into a desert in only a couple of weeks. That's kind of what I think of when I think of consequences. What would happen if you realistically did this? And what would it cost on you to make that happen? What would it cause on the rest of the world to make that happen? What would be the societal implications of people, say, having a rift where there's the people who know what they're doing when it comes to magic, being like, look, we can't do what you're asking us to do because there's all these problems that would cause, and the normal people who don't understand magic or whatever getting demanding about it. What would happen if you had a couple different like magical races going around and they didn't quite understand one another? How would that affect things? What would happen if the magic races or whatever that were all in one area started having conflicts with one another, where there was something that caused a lot of issues for them, like say a disease wiped a bunch of them out or something? This is stuff that I've tried writing before and just kind of hit walls on. Like, what if there was like a disease that wiped out most of these magical creatures, and now they're just absolutely freaking out trying to get things reestablished and trying to do everything they can to get back on their feet, and it's gotten completely out of hand, but the humans don't notice because they live somewhere else? What would the consequences of that be? Another thing to think about, in your setting, what are the consequences of, say, being disabled, being LGBT, being, again, a different, a different race or species than the standard, your economic status, your education status, your job, your class status, your who your family is. Heck, if you're doing like something with like someone who's traveling around a lot, especially in a fantasy setting, what would people's reactions be to someone from Kingdom A walking, traveling through Kingdom B or to get to Kingdom C or something, There are going to be consequences. And if you think about it, you could do language barriers in that situation, you could do cultural conflicts, you could do all kinds of stuff. And that's where things get interesting, is if you think about the little details that you can use to flesh out the worlds, but also that would impact the plot. And that is where a lot of things kind of fall flat these days, because they hit certain tropes and they think, okay, I want to do this bad mafia boss, bad boy romance thing. Well, think about the consequences of that, the reality of that kind of situation. The characters are going to be, dealing with the police probably. They're going to be dealing with back alley deals. They're going to be dealing with corruption, bribes, things like that. And if you think about how that kind of lifestyle is going to affect and impact the life of the, the girl in that situation, because it's always a girl or, some little Twinkie dude. If you think about the implications of that, and you possibly think about how you can make it even more interesting by I've been thinking about writing something like that with the twist of the mafia boss thinks the person they're trying to seduce, I'm still hashing out some of these deals, the person they're trying to seduce is perfectly innocent, but they're really the most prolific moonshiner in the country. Things like that. You can make some really interesting stuff if you just look at what the specifics of that situation are and think about how that would actually affect what's going on and how you can twist it to make it really interesting. I mean, heck, you could do that little stupid isekai crap where either a character goes into a different world, but you can make it to where, yeah, sure, they're a person going into like a more primitive world to teach, and they're got to teach people stuff, like Dr. Stone or something. But instead of doing like standard tech, you do things that are practical. I'm talking, you could have someone who's a homesteader or a farmer or something like that get transported to a place where they're having trouble figuring out how to get agriculture going. That would be really interesting to read. You could have someone who's, say, a tailor or something, go into a place where they've got a very bland, basic fashion style, and they could change things there. It's very interesting what you can do, but you gotta think, what would realistically be useful for one of those go back to historical times or whatever type of situations? You gotta think, what would be realistically feasible and what would be an interesting twist on this situation? Again, you got the mafia romance thing. Make the person who is being seduced or whatever by the mafia boss secretly be some kind of criminal or whatever themselves. An assassin, a mercenary, a moonshiner, something like that. You could do something interesting there. You could do, granted, there's some tropes tied to that too, but you could do some interesting stuff with that. You could do that whole, like, stupid werewolf romance thing. But you could do like your own twist on it. You don't have to stick to just werewolves, and you don't have to. Please stop it with the way things have gone with the Omegaverse crap in novels. It was a fan fiction thing originally, and even we're getting tired of it on fan fiction because and if you're gonna get into it and write it for original works, look into what it's become now, and please understand the rules and what were, the intricacies and stuff were tied to it, because it's terrible in original works, because there are the whole like genre basically has evolved over the years and become more and more complicated and intricate. But the people who are hijacking it for original stuff, okay, let's be real. It started off as an excuse to do impreg and like have like interesting gay stuff going on, but it's better. It's more commonly used for gay, LGBT stuff for a reason. Now, I digress back. But if you're doing like some kind of like supernatural, paranormal romance, which is a whole genre that I absolutely love, if you're doing paranormal romance, think about maybe different kind of lesser known creatures you could do with it, use for it. You could think about, certain types of magic, of, supernatural creatures and stuff are more like broad terms than necessarily specifics. If you want to do a soulmate type thing, I've got some characters that I've written up like this, where there are certain kinds of fae and whatnot that are literally just fairies and like fae and stuff that are like the name for them is literally basically translates to sweetheart, because they're literally, their whole purpose is they kind of imprint, or so to speak, on their soulmate, and they will do whatever it takes to be that by that person's side. You can do some interesting stuff with that. Really interesting stuff with that. There is so much potential out there. All it takes is a little bit of research and a little bit of thinking about what the consequences of doing of writing what you're writing would be. The consequences of the setting, the characters, the basic premise, if you can think about that, and you can start fleshing out things and taking like the little bowl of like your little bowl of like basic noodles, which is your tropes, your setting, your characters and stuff, and start adding like some flavor and stuff with your like and sauce or whatever in the form of basically fleshing things out and thinking outside the box, you can make some really, really cool stuff. And don't worry about getting things cranked out quickly. Let it cook. Let it stay in the slow cooker for a while. There's a reason why me and my friend Skillet on Ac3 took 7 months to write our first big, heavy-duty Joker fight. And that's because we were really thinking about how we were going to pull it off and how we were going to pull it off well. And that is probably the best chapter we've written so far. Because we thought, okay, here's a character that's very difficult to write. Here's kind of where we're pulling the influences from. Now, here's what we've decided for his quirk, because it is a My Hero Academia Batman crossover. So Joker obviously has a quirk. Here's his quirk. How does his quirk work specifically? Okay. How does he take advantage of his quirk? How does he compensate for the weaknesses of it? And how does he disguise these issues he has regarding using it? How does he fight? How does he get to people to let them get his, get under their skin so he can throw them off guard? How does he make it to where he can go basically toe-to-toe with All Might without actually having to punch him that much? Those were things we thought of. And then we very carefully took our time to work on it. And it also gave me an excuse to go ham on the horror. So don't worry about taking a while to write something. And don't worry about word counts or page counts or anything. Write what works, write what comes to you, and just get your first draft done and on paper, and then worry about everything else. The only thing you have to caveat to that is, again, consequences to everything. And when you think about those consequences, it'll start opening you up to ways to think outside the box. I keep looping a bit, but you kind of understand what I'm saying. If you know what would happen if this actually occurred, you can think about ways to make it more of an interesting situation, and in some cases less problematic. Like those power dynamic situations, or like, really dangerous person with like an innocent little blonde doll type character. You can make that a lot more balanced. Again, if you make that little innocent blonde little, baby doll looking type of character, you know what I'm talking about. If you make them more than they seem, and that's where things get interesting. And that right there is called trope subversion. And that's where things get really good. I'll make another video about tropes and stuff. This is getting kind of long, but you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. There is ways to make things interesting. It just takes a little bit of time cooking in your noggin before you can really start getting things really cool. Anyway, thank you. I know it's getting kind of long. Again, it's like 24 minutes right now. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or anything you want to ask, just put them in the comments. I'll read the comments and see what y'all want to know about, and I'll start factoring that in later. I will link in my description my Ac3 if you want to read what I write, and I will keep you posted on my original works as they come along. But for now, it is a lot of experimental drafts and a big project that I kind of tentative about talking about on here, because it's mostly just writing stuff, and I'll probably put crochet stuff and sewing stuff on here too, because I do that kind of thing too. Anyway, again, thank you for watching. I'll guess I'll post again. You'll see me again soon.